Has throughout the week. Fran Kelly is joining us from our Sydney studios on Gadigal land. Well, as we go to air today, the High Court is sitting in deliberation on an application that it revisit the matter of federal Liberal Party pre-selections and the intervention that was done at the behest of Scott Morrison and the New South Wales Premier. We have reporters based there at the court, and if and when any news emerges, we will go to the court to bring that to you. In the meantime, yes, welcome back, Fran. Why don't we launch then into Scott Morrison's options? He's been out and about in Melbourne today and surrounds, down near Geelong in fact, working on a bit of product differentiation with Anthony Albanese.
I know not all the decisions that I've taken everyone's agreed with. I know that not every government is perfect, particularly in times like this. But what I also know is I know who I am, and I know what I'm about. I know what our policies are. I know who my team is. I'm not pretending to be anyone else. I'm standing by my record and the plans that I have for the future.
I feel like...
All right, so Fran, yes, so we'll bring you in at that point. Scott Morrison knows who he is. These comments, of course, come at the end of a week when it's very much been about character, his and Anthony Albanese's, but he's trying definitely now to make it about the latter.
Well, he certainly is trying to make it about the latter. He's also trying to make a virtue of the fact that the figures show quite clearly, in fact, and I'll come to this in a moment, some of his own MPs are quite open about the fact that the electorate's not that keen on Scott Morrison at the moment. So that's what the numbers show, that's what the anecdotal evidence is, that's what some of his own MPs, for instance, Katie Allen, who's a Liberal MP in Higgins, quoted today saying, well, they're not so happy with Scott, that's for sure. But, you know, so he's getting out on the front foot, trying to put the focus on Anthony Albanese, because a lot of the polls also show that there's a big undecided feel for Anthony Albanese. And, you know, if you ask some of these Liberal MPs in some of these inner city marginal seats where Scott Morrison is really not popular at all, and a lot of these inner city Liberals are having, you know, fending off independent attacks over issues like climate, for instance, that there's significant, you know, chipping away at the Liberal Party vote there. You know, their view of things is that, well, it's true, they don't like Scott Morrison much, but they like me, and they don't know much about Albo, and if they think about it, they're not sure they like him much either. So they're going for instance, if you look at Katie Allen's campaign, her slogan is taking care of Higgins. We know that Dave Sharma in Wentworth, another one of those vulnerable Liberal seats, he doesn't even have Liberal Party branding on his promotional material. And Trent Zimmerman in North Sydney yesterday, when he was our guest, he suggested that, you know, he's quite popular in his own seat, so they're trying to make it as much about them as they can in recognition the PM is not all that popular, and Scott Morrison basically backing that up today. Yeah,
just elaborating on Katie Allen, who you referred to there, Fran, she did acknowledge this unpopularity, but are we aware whether she would in fact be open to the idea of Scott Morrison joining her in that electorate of Higgins if necessary?
Yeah, well, when asked about this, she has said she'd welcome it, and in fact, if you go through her Instagram feed, you see that when Scott Morrison has come to her electorate, he seems to be mobbed. So whether it's a negative or not, you know, we're unsure. But she and others, and as many as the pollsters were telling us just the other day, you know, acknowledge that the electorate is angry, it is unsettled, and it is a bit undecided. And we had some more evidence on that front, Greg, too, today, with news of a poll done in the seat of Mackellar, Liberal seat of Mackellar. Very, very safe, was one of the Liberal Party's safer seats, in fact. The sitting candidate there, Jason Falinski, he was on our show on Monday. He's being challenged by one of the Climate 200 endorsed Liberals, Independents, Sophie Scamps, and we saw some of her polling today, which suggests she's making quite significant inroads into Jason Falinski's primary vote. Something like this poll shows his primary vote dropping from 53 to 35. If that's true, he's in trouble. So, you know, there is a sense that these Liberals who are under these attacks, there is a bit of a sense, particularly in Victoria, where there's a number of them, that lockdown has maybe given them a bit of insulation against the anti-Morrison feeling, because in that time, so much of the electorate, it was just sort of them against the world, particularly in Melbourne for so long. So they've gotten attached to their local MPs, and there's a bit of a sense that that could be working for them, not against them. But we will see. Yeah,
fascinating. Why don't we turn it over to the Labor leader now, Fran. Anthony Albanese's been in Adelaide with candidates, but also with Premier Peter Malinauskas. He's made a commitment to honour a deal for environmental water flows in the Murray-Darling Basin, which always seems popular with South Australians, even though it's only what's described as a 5-point plan at present. But it's also clear that Anthony Albanese's growing impatient for the pre-campaign to come to an end pretty soon. Why don't we just listen to a bit of him and then we'll talk about it afterwards, Fran.
I feel like putting in a phone call to the Prime Minister if he doesn't know where the Governor-General lives and offer him a lift to the lodge to call this election, because this absurdity of not having the election called so that he can continue to spend taxpayer funds on election ads in the name of the government, but they're really about promoting the Liberal and National parties.
Yeah, hurry up is the general idea there. But, Fran, what are MPs to do? I mean, there's an opportunity for Scott Morrison tomorrow and there's one on Sunday, but otherwise, I guess many are having to plan to be here as per the sitting schedule in Canberra come Monday.
Yeah, I've only just realised that Parliament was scheduled to sit next week. I don't think it'll be sitting, Greg, and I think if MPs are suggesting they're booking flights, well, that's just in case. I mean, think about it. Why would the Morrison government want to come back and be subjected to the sort of cauldron of question time and, you know, on the doors, all of that? I don't think they'd want to. Look, Anthony Albanese, it's a cheap political trick saying, come on, I'll give you a lift, though, you know, if the Prime Minister doesn't know where the Governor-General lives. Well, neither did Anthony Albanese. He lives in Yarralumla, not at the lodge. But you know, that's just a stunt, let's put it that way. But Labor perhaps is worried about the government being able to keep shoveling out what they're suggesting is $1 million a day, I think, aren't they? Or $1 million a week on government advertising.
Yeah. Plus the appointments as well, yeah.
And the appointments and incumbency, just the value of incumbency. Maybe he's just, you know, an untested opposition leader, hasn't faced a campaign and he wants to get on with it. But I think the people are with him, really. Why the delay? The longer it goes on, the more people think, well, why is this guy, you know, taking his time? What's he trying to sort of sneak through? Why doesn't he just call the election? So I think that's a general feeling, really. Let's get on with it.
Yeah, very soon, I think, was the latest formulation of words from Scott Morrison. Read into that what you will. Fran,
I'm reading
I know
into
you've
it the
got
weekend. That's what I'm choosing to read into it.
Fair enough. You've got a chat coming up in just a moment, but we might just recap briefly our main stories today. And they include Justice meets party politics. The High Court's in session to weigh up whether it should sit in judgment on the rules Liberals have used to pick their election candidates. Up and away, Bushmaster troop transport trucks are loaded and lifted on their way towards Ukraine with yet more weapons to follow. And water everywhere in the east, but arguments abound over how much to send down the Murray-Darling rivers for environmental purposes.
Keeping Australia safe is a key pitch from Scott Morrison heading into this election campaign as the Prime Minister seeks to contrast his record on defence spending with Labor's when they were last in government. Today, the government promised an additional $26.5 million in military support to Ukraine and a pledge to help rebuild the war-ravaged country.
If there's a requirement to provide more support, then Australia is prepared to consider all of that. There's obviously been a lot of humanitarian support that we've provided. There'll also be a big ask of, you know, the developed world to contribute to the rebuild within the Ukraine, the shelling of residential areas, the destruction of facilities, of government buildings, of all of that infrastructure, which has, you know, been the second tragedy, followed of, you know, obviously by the human tragedy. It'll take a lot of money and support to rebuild, and Australia will be there with Ukraine during that stage as well.
That's Defence Minister Peter Dutton. Well, Brendan O'Connor is the Shadow Defence Minister. Brendan O'Connor, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Good afternoon and welcome back, Fran.
Thank you very much. Do you support the Defence Minister's pledge there that Australia will be there as part of a coalition to help rebuild Ukraine?
I do. Whatever differences we have with the government, we have no difference when it comes to responding to this illegal, violent invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And we support the lethal and non-lethal aid that's been provided and any subsequent support. And indeed, I think the reconstruction of that city that's been under siege clearly will need help from not just its European friends, but friends around the world.
In terms of subsequent spending, we've seen Australia come in now with a number of pledges. We're about to head into an election campaign, therefore caretaker mode. As Shadow Defence Minister, would you be expected to be consulted on any new decisions in terms of, what Australia might offer in terms of support or what's needed?
I would. Certainly through caretaker mode, where the decisions made in that period, we would have to be briefed. That's consistent with parliamentary convention and the Westminster system. We would also hope to be briefed even if the decisions have been made before the election was called, because if it's a significant decision and it goes to national security, then the Labor leader and the Shadow Foreign Minister and myself and others should be briefed.
It was revealed today that Russia has now imposed sanctions on 228 Australian, I think they're government MPs, basically all of them, including the Prime Minister. Are you on that list, and are you concerned about it?
Well, I haven't seen the list, and I'm not surprised there'd be retaliation by Russia, but what we have done today is to stand up for, sovereignty, independence and democracy. And we had no choice but to do that. And if Russia wants to retaliate, again, not surprising, but I don't think we were in any position to do anything other than stand with NATO, with the European Union, Great Britain, the United States, Canada and others in defending Ukraine's right to exist.
Well, talking about standing with our allies, China's responded angrily to the AUKUS announcement this week that the US, UK and Australia will develop hypersonic weapons, accusing the three allies of, quote, trying to build an Asia-Pacific version of NATO. Does Labor back the development of these hypersonic weapons?
We do. We do need to have sufficient firepower to deter potential conflict. We do need to, and also we also need to increase the firepower on existing platforms now, not just in 2038. So anything that can be done to increase our capacity and which will act as a deterrent to conflict, we would be wanting to do. And from government, we'll certainly be examining that, as Anthony Albanese has made very clear. As for AUKUS is about deepening our relationship with traditional allies and aligned countries. And it's a good thing, as is the Quad. But what is its goal? Its goal is to ensure the maintenance of peace and stability. And that's why, of course, we're very concerned about the government dropping the ball on the Solomon Islands as what might happen there in relation to the agreement it might strike with China.
Well, the AUKUS agreement, of course, in your reference to 2038, I think that's a reference to when the nuclear submarines agreed to that Australia's going to get under the AUKUS agreement are likely to be delivered. The Scott Morrison is today accused of watering down his promise that those nuclear subs would be built in Adelaide. Whenever they're built, they'll be built in Adelaide. This is a big issue in South Australia heading into election campaign. What's Labor's commitment?
Well, our commitment is we want to build defence assets here, including the submarines. Labor's the only political party when in government that built submarines in this country. And we want to do whatever we can. There'll be components of any proposed nuclear-propelled submarine that could not be built here, the nuclear component. But what we should be doing is ensuring if it can be built here, it is. And if it can't be built here, we increase our capability over time. What's
the definition of can't? I mean, is it not the best, or it's not the cheapest, or it's not the fastest?
No. If we literally don't have the capacity, if there is some element that where we are deficient, we need to build that capability. But the other important part is we need enforceable provisions in the contracts. The problem with even that $5.5 billion contract that was scrapped with no subs, there was no provisions, sufficient provisions that compelled the prime contractor to include local content. So you need mandatory and enforceable provisions in such huge, very expensive, very long defence contracts.
Just to veer away from defence for a moment, some news today that all the Medivac refugees have been released from Australian detention, that hotel detention that they were in. You're a former immigration minister. Why do you think the government's done this now? They've been letting them out in dribs and drabs over the last few weeks without any notice particularly?
Well, it is surprising. I can only imagine that there are some electorates in Victoria and New South Wales which are traditionally Liberal-held seats, which they're worried about, particularly where independents are running. I don't want to be so cynical, but this is after nearly a decade in government. They're releasing certain refugees. It's a very expensive thing to keep them there, 50 or more than 50,000 a night, as I understand it. And if there's no security issues and safety issues, then of course they should have been released earlier.
Brendan O'Connor, national security will be a key issue in this election. The Prime Minister and Peter Dutton will make certain of that. Voters will want to know before they cast their votes who will be the Defence Minister in a Labor government. Will it be you?
Well, that's entirely up to the Labor leader. I was asked to undertake this role, Fran, in January last year. I've been in the portfolio longer than Peter Dutton, at least in the shadow portfolio, and I've enjoyed it. I come with some national security experience. I sat on the National Security Committee of Cabinet, and I was, as you say, Home Affairs Minister and Immigration Minister. So I think I've got the experience and expertise to work in this area, but it is entirely up to Anthony.
Yeah, but have you sought assurances from Anthony Albanese?
No, I haven't.
You're going to be in a hot seat in this election campaign. The opposition's putting pressure on the government to say who's going to be the health minister. The reverse is true, isn't it?
No, look, I haven't sought. Look, the remit is with the Labor leader. That's, as you know, that's how it operates. Look. Obviously, Anthony has confidence in me. That's why he has asked me to undertake this role. I'll be very happy to do that, and I would be very happy to do it in government, and I think I've got the capability to do it. But that is, as I say, that's the discretion of the Labor leader. As for Scott Morrison, he made commitments to people before the last election, and they didn't end up being ministers in those portfolios. So, whatever he says, I'm not sure you can entirely believe him.
Brendan O'Connor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Fran.
Brendan O'Connor,
All right, sticking with matters of national security, and Caroline Kennedy appears to be ready to book her flight to Canberra from New York or from Massachusetts now that she's been through the Senate process to confirm her nomination in the US. The daughter of former President John F. Kennedy sat before the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee overnight and stressed to senators that she appreciates the tensions building in the Indo-Pacific these days, tensions which weren't as obvious in her last diplomatic posting to Tokyo. That was for Barack Obama.
You're from Australia?
Welcome.
Things have really changed and increased in the region, the tensions, since my time in Japan. All the countries out there have dealt with each other for a very long time, but certainly Australia most recently has been challenged by Chinese economic coercion, and I think that the United States can learn a lot from their response. They've stood firm, and I think they've managed to come together with a bipartisan foreign policy, and I think a greater and deeper partnership with us in the security and diplomatic areas, as well as across the board, that will serve our country and theirs well as we move forward into this increasingly tense time in the Indo-Pacific.
Something's happening in the region right now that I'm sure you're well aware of in the Solomon Islands. The Chinese Communist Party has been very engaged in that region, working with the government of the Solomon Islands. They're stepping in now and talking about constructing a bilateral security agreement. It's very concerning to us as a nation here. I know it's very concerning to the Australians as well. What do you think the prospects are for that bilateral security agreement being entered between China and the Solomon Islands, and what should the United States posture be relative to that?
Well, obviously, I'm not fully read in on that, but if confirmed, I would work very hard. Australia has a very active diplomacy, embassy in every Pacific Island nation, and it's been a historic area of United States engagement as well. And I think that the fact that we are reopening our embassy in the Solomon Islands, that can't come soon enough. I think that together with Australia, with the infrastructure partnership that we have in the Pacific Islands, which I know that you worked to initiate when you were ambassador to Japan, we can do more and we should do more, and we must stay engaged. This is a vital region. And I think that we need to be more visible, but I think that our long record in the region of support and assistance over many years, if we are able to build on that, we can really make a difference.
Thank you. Welcome. It shouldn't be too painful.
Now, the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal was addressed by Caroline Kennedy in those hearings there, although she noted herself that there aren't many details available on it just yet. The whole subject of submarines has been very close to South Australian Senator Rex Patrick throughout his time in Parliament. He came as a replacement to Nick Xenophon as a Centre Alliance senator and is now an independent who's heading back to Adelaide to start campaigning for his seat. We spoke to him just before he left Parliament House today. Rex Patrick, thanks for joining us again on Afternoon Briefing at the end of a pretty hectic schedule for you around Senate estimates. As always, you've been paying attention to the defence program and planning for the nuclear submarines. Are we any clearer at the end of this week how much involvement Adelaide is going to have in the construction of the nuclear subs?
Well, sadly, we're not. And in fact, I think the Prime Minister let it slip that it's unlikely that these submarines will be built in Adelaide. You know, the government in 2020 offered or announced a Pacific step-up ship, which it clearly said was going to be built in Australia. Then in September 21, it changed its mind on the basis of changing circumstances, and that ship will now be acquired from overseas.
Right.
Now, in relation to this, you know, the Prime Minister announced a 2040 delivery nuclear-powered submarine. That is just too late.
But is it reasonable to get from the government a figure on the percentage of local manufacture when we don't even know what submarine we're talking about? I know you had one with the French project, but it's actually too early to be extracting commitments, isn't it?
Well, I think the problem is that we end up with the likelihood that the first or second submarine will be built overseas, and potentially from there on in, the work will remain overseas. And we have to keep pressure up around this. Look, my view is 2040 is too late, 2035 is too late. We've walked away from a program. The government spent $5.5 billion not delivering any submarine at all. That has wasted a huge amount of time. I think we're at the point where we have to say an interim solution is required. We need to go out and look at a Japanese or a German submarine design, build it in Adelaide, improve it with Australian industry. We could do that for $20 billion. We'd have welding equipment up and running within 18 months, and that addresses the now problem that we're supposed to be dealing with in defence. 2040 won't help us with the geostrategic circumstances that we are in unless that nuclear submarine has a time machine.
But what would we do with stopgap submarines of the type you've just described once the nuclear ones came through?
Well, I think we have to look at that in the longer term. The strategic situation has changed from 2009 when this program first came about, where we were looking at projecting power into the South China Sea. We've seen more recently that Chinese warships are now turning up off the Queensland coast every year and watching our exercises. We saw at the start of the year a Chinese warship transiting through the Arafura Sea, lighting up a Royal Australian Air Force aircraft with a laser, and now there's talk about a Chinese military base, a naval base, in the Solomons. Back in your state of South Australia, Anthony Albanese was campaigning there this morning, and he's made a commitment today to a 5-point plan for the Murray-Darling Basin that would include 450 gigalitres of water for environmental purposes. Does that put the ambitions for the Murray-Darling plan back on track? Well, I find this interesting because actually the current government will make the claim that they're fully committed to the plan, and in fact all that Anthony Albanese is doing is saying the same thing. The devil is in the delivery. an example is the 450 gigalitres. That was negotiated into the plan back in 2012 by the South Australian Government. It was the condition upon which we agreed to the plan, and so far the government has delivered 2 gigalitres. Now, the difficulty we've got is that everyone says that they're committed to it, but there's no plan to deliver it, and that's the thing that's important. And that's one of the reasons why you need people like me in the Senate holding these people to account and calling their bluff when they simply make commitments without plans.
All right, well, you're about to go home and mount a campaign proper for your own seat. Tall order, though, you'd have to acknowledge. Take us into your campaign strategy. How do you beat once colleague, now rival, Nick Xenophon, amongst many others, for that seat?
Oh, look, I'm basically asking South Australians in general to vote for me. It's not about a competition between myself or Nick Xenophon. I want South Australians to look at my track record, my 4.5 years in the Senate. I've done an awful lot of work. I've done lots and lots on transparency. I've been fighting for the Murray. I've been fighting for local manufacturing. I'm quite convinced that without my manoeuvring here in Parliament House, we wouldn't have had the Collins submarine full cycle docking work being done in South Australia still. All I can do is communicate to South Australians what it is that I've been doing, what it is that I plan to do next, and let them judge me on my performance.
And you've got money and resources ready to go. I imagine you'll be underway fairly shortly on this campaign.
Yeah, look, these things do take money to be able to communicate those messages, and I have had some donations. Nowhere near where the major parties are.
Or even where you were with Centre Alliance resources, I imagine.
Look, I'm doing okay, but only okay in the context of independents. Independents really do struggle to raise money. I'm very grateful. When I get a donation, whether it's $1,000 or $10, I end up ringing the person. Often the $10 donation makes me feel better because I feel like that person probably couldn't afford the $10 but has made the donation, and I'm always very grateful for that. And that allows me to get out and communicate what it is that I've done. One of the problems independents always have is that there's about 20% of the population who are fully engaged in politics, and the rest just go about their business and make their decision on as they're lining up to vote.
So you have to catch them on that day?
Well, I have to try and get a message to them that says, I'm really trying for South Australia. I don't have any allegiances to any parties that are in Queensland or New South Wales or Victoria. I'm there exclusively for South Australia, trying to get that message across to people who are just going about their daily lives and ignoring politics, as I understand people might want to do. That's the challenge.
Yep, but they do have to cast a vote, so you'll be out there harvesting as much as you can. Good luck with that. It's a challenge for you. Rex Patrick, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Fran Kelly, you can't underestimate the enormity of the task for an independent like Rex Patrick and others like him trying to get their way back into the Senate. But the degree of difficulty goes up. It's not just about the dollars and the resources. As you were discussing earlier this week, we also have some COVID challenges still for candidates of all stripe to contend with.
That's true, and no one knows how this is going to play out. Maybe South Australians have an idea because, of course, they saw a one-term Liberal government, the Steve Marshall government, thrown out just not long ago, and that was largely thought it might have been off the back of his decision to open the borders just before Christmas, of course, in line with what the Prime Minister was urging the states to do. COVID came in and it mucked up some people's Christmas, so maybe they are all more aware in South Australia there where Rex Patrick is. But the issue for Rex Patrick, I think, of course, is that, he was once on the ticket in a party with Nick Xenophon. Now, will the two of them cannibalise each other's vote, and will that leave it possible for One Nation or United Australia Party to come in through the middle and get that Senate spot? So I think he's facing more than just the normal challenges of an independent. But you're right, Greg, as we've been discussing already, COVID, it's going to play out in all sorts of ways in this election campaign because it's the first federal poll that we're heading into since the start of the pandemic. And the Electoral Commissioner, Tom Rogers, has said today that his team is prepared for the challenges that lie ahead, including the challenges of getting those ballots into aged care.
it's a big issue for us at the moment to prepare, and it's going to be a very complex election, but we are putting in place a whole range of measures to deal with that. And, without going into all the boring statistics, I think we're using something like 63,000 litres of hand sanitizer, 34,000 litres of surface cleaner. We've got extra staff, measures, and a whole range of things to deal with that particular issue. We're working with state and federal health authorities, and indeed the aged care homes themselves, to work out how best to service the residents of those homes. We've got a dedicated team of people that are contacting those homes to make sure that we can provide that service. In some cases, there'll still be visits. In other cases, we'll be relying on postal voting. And again, that's based on health advice. The last thing we want to do is to turn the election into some sort of super spreader event. We're moving very cautiously and carefully with that.
Yeah, so the Electoral Commission well advanced in its preparations, apparently. Just enough time for us today before we move on to Journo panel discussions and other matters for a check-in with Labor MP and member for Macnamara. That's a seat around Melbourne. Josh Burns is back with us on Afternoon Briefing. Thanks for your patience today. Josh, can I just ask you about an issue which is not unique to Melbourne, but which is finding some resolution? This is Medivac asylum seekers, but mostly refugees who've been brought to the Australian mainland. It does appear now that all are out of detention. They've been granted bridging visas. Overdue?
Well, good afternoon, Greg. It's pretty extraordinary that it's been almost a decade and finally Scott Morrison is releasing people into the community. And you have to ask yourself the big question: why on earth did it take almost 10 years? Peter Dutton himself said that it cost more to keep people in detention than it did to allow them to move into the community. It costs almost $50,000 or just over $50,000 a night per person to keep them in detention. And Scott Morrison has just wasted almost 10 years of their life. Over the last 3 years, I've been moving motions in the House of Representatives calling for the release of people in indefinite detention. Of course, we're pleased to allow them to finally get on with their lives. But while we're on this topic, Greg, I would also say that we should absolutely be allowing the Murugappan family to be returning home to Biloela. It's been a really traumatic ordeal for that family, and while the Scott Morrison's on a roll, I'd like to see that family released back to their home in Queensland.
Yeah, I think that was the subject of some questions at Senate estimates the last week or so, and they did appear, officials, to be holding the line. But anyway, that may have a way still to run. The election campaign, we've already been talking about it at length. Josh Burns, 6% is your margin there in Macnamara, and if there is a threat to come, I guess it could be mounted by the Greens. Where's your campaign at? I guess you're not sitting around waiting for Scott Morrison. You're not coming back to Canberra, I assume. So, yeah, what are you doing to fend off the Greens?
Look, we've been out in the community in Macnamara talking to thousands of people that I am absolutely privileged to represent, Greg. It's a great honour to be a Member of Parliament. It's one that I am really grateful to the people of Macnamara for allowing me to have this opportunity to represent them in the federal parliament. And yeah, we're working extremely hard to try and connect with as many people as possible and talk to them about what's important to their lives. The key themes that are coming through in Macnamara are they want a government that will tackle climate change, that are thinking about the next generation, how we transition our economy from high emissions into low emissions. They're thinking about the future of work. A lot of people in my electorate are renters. The cost of housing is extraordinary for many people, and wages are flatlining. So we need to be thinking about how people are working in this country and the future of work, moving people from casual work into full-time secure work. These are the issues that people are talking to me about, and we'll keep working hard right up to election day.
I noticed, and Frank Kelly was discussing it earlier, that a near neighbour of yours, Katie Allen, had conceded the Prime Minister may be a little unpopular in her part of the electorate, but she'd have him nonetheless. Have you booked Anthony Albanese as a campaign guest for you over the next 5 weeks or so?
Absolutely. We're We're looking forward to having Anthony in the campaign in McNamara. There's a couple of hopefully exciting events that we'll be doing. I can't release them on ABC, but I'm absolutely looking forward to having Anthony come and campaign alongside me in McNamara.
All right.
I have to say, on Higgins, it was pretty extraordinary to have a federal Liberal member saying how much of a liability the Prime Minister is, and how she even said that she's more popular than Scott Morrison, which I thought was a line that probably made someone's head fall off in the Prime Minister's
I think she
office.
also said that Anthony Albanese was even more unpopular in in her part of the world.
Well, if the Prime Minister's office cleared those lines, I'll buy someone a slab. But anyway, look, the point is that Scott Morrison is probably not going to be campaigning in McNamara. He's probably not going to be campaigning in Higgins and Goldstein either. So we'll be absolutely welcoming Anthony Albanese to help elect the Labor government in Melbourne.
Okay, well, look, our time is really compressed today, unfortunately. Things blowing out all over the shop. But we're going to thank you again for joining us, Josh Burns, on Afternoon Briefing, a regular guest, and no doubt we'll be talking to you again before too long.
Have a good weekend, Greg.
All right, so Fran, we're about to roll in, somewhat belatedly, it must be said, to our Journo chat panel, which we always like to run to some length of a Friday. But yeah, final thought from you, thanking you greatly from this end anyway for joining us all week. You'll be back with us next week. Try and get yourself a break perhaps, Fran, over the weekend.
No, I'm on Insiders actually on the weekend, Greg, so no break, no rest for the wicked, but I'll actually be with you in Canberra there in the studio on Monday because, of course, we're expecting it to be the first day of the campaign. But just on that, I noticed we're all guessing when's the Prime Minister going to go to Government House. Zali Steggall, the independent member for Warringah, has tweeted just a little while ago, more games from the government. We've just been given the parliamentary program for next week, which implies no election is being called this weekend. So, you know, I don't think it does mean that, Greg. I don't think it will mean that, but hey,
it could just
keeps us guessing.
Yeah, exactly. It could just be sensible preparation. But let's see. Can't wait to see you here in Canberra. I hope that all works out for us. And we do see you on Monday right here. Fran Kelly, thanks for joining us throughout the week.
See ya.
Welcome to the Friday briefing, when we take a look back at the week and perhaps also at the one that lies ahead. Joining us today will be Greg Brown from The Australian, Parliament Bureau Chief for The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, Angus Livinston, and Matilda Boseley from The Guardian. They'll all be here in just a moment, but in case you hadn't noticed, here's a quick recap of a week in which much was said, but nothing actually occurred, electorally speaking at least.
Gorgeous.
This is Mr Albanese, mate.
Yeah, I'm running for Prime Minister.
Good to be here in Perth. You got you all in there?
Well, he's certainly used race in the past on several occasions. Against you? Against many other people.
I think I've been very clear. I absolutely reject that as malicious slurs. It is outrageous.
It doesn't stack up with the Scott Morrison I know.
It is not true what is being said about the Prime Minister. I said in my statement today, he is a strong leader, but he's also a good man.
You look much nicer in reality than what you do.
Oh, actually good. Did you get that?
Cheers. Thanks, mate. No worries.
There you go. You've got to have a cherry tomato.
This reckless rorting and wasteful spending must stop. How long do you really need before driving up to see the Governor General?
Well, you'll know very soon.
How soon?
Very soon.
How soon? Sunday?
You'll know when I'm announcing.
Hi, how you going?
Done.
Hours old.
The community attitude towards the federal government is very hostile at the moment. I would say it's on fire, actually.
You better do something. I don't care. I'm sick of your bull.
Okay, so still no election, but plenty of activity to talk about all the same. Welcome to the studio, Angus Livinston of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, right here in Canberra. The Australian's Greg Brown is also in Canberra. Welcome, Greg. And The Guardian's Matilda Boseley joining us remotely. Welcome back, Matilda. So maybe to you, first of all, Angus, it's very hard, it's getting harder by the day to interpret Scott Morrison's words, but he did say today that he wants the parliament to run full term. He observed the date of the last election was the 18th of May. It doesn't exactly clear up for us whether we're looking at the 21st or the 14th as you do the maths.
I think there's a real question about whether he wants Parliament to come back next week on Monday. It's House of Reps sitting only.
Doesn't make much sense, does it?
No, not particularly. And there'll be a lot of MPs who I think would be much happier campaigning in their electorate, especially ones under threat, than coming here for a sitting where there's no legislation to pass and nothing to do. It
would be a pretty odd sitting, Greg Brown, yet we do hear that flights are being booked by MPs, that draft paperwork is out for the House next week. Do you agree with Angus? Unlikely that this would happen?
Well, it'd be remarkable if it did happen, because the government has not had a good time of it during sitting weeks. Obviously, its numbers are very tight, even in the House of Representatives. And
what would they actually do, right?
Well, exactly. And Morrison hasn't called the campaign yet, but he's been out campaigning in electorates. He's not particularly ever comfortable in Canberra or in the Parliament. So I would be really surprised if he decided to come back and debate nothing.
Yep. Matilda, is it only we who sit around paid to write about these things and think about these things who actually care, or do you think you can wait too long in playing these things out, formally at least, campaigning?
Look, I mean, I think everyone's got a bit of a sense that there's meant to be an election coming up. It always is a sort of question about how much anyone actually pays attention to the minutiae, but the look of, waiting until, maybe these accusations of bullying die down, or maybe there's a clean stretch without something going wrong, I think is kind of serving to highlight that there hasn't been. Like, there has not really been a clean 2 weeks in almost since the bushfires, really. Right. So I think there is a risk of people just getting extremely fed up, especially now that we've got, everyone in media extremely ready to actually make this happen. That's obviously sort of filtering through that frustration.
Yeah, and Angus, it's, there's prime ministerial discretion here, but there are also actually, at the moment at which we speak, legal complications potentially as well. We're hearing word that the High Court's not dragging its feet, but it's taking a while to get towards any resolution there. Is the Prime Minister powerless to do anything while this is outstanding?
I think the government doesn't believe so. They think that they can call the election regardless of whatever's going on in the High Court. And they've made their position pretty clear just this afternoon, in that they believe that this court case is just going to drag out a legal quagmire that will only benefit Matthew Camanzuli, who is the Liberal who's been ejected from the party because of this challenge. But they're sitting right now. We've got reporters in there right now. I'm not sure what's going to happen. So
no, neither do we. There was some suggestion that proceedings might have been delayed, Greg Brown, by half an hour or so. But anyway, when word emerges from there, we'll try and bring it to you. But as Matilda was noting there, Greg, this idea of clear air, it seems somewhat elusive for the government, as it has been for a long while now. That forces us to reflect on the last week, where once again Scott Morrison's character, a little bit of heckling, a little bit of complaint from a New South Wales Liberal upper house member, soon to quit her seat. Your thoughts on that elusive chase for clear air for the Prime Minister?
Well, you're right. It's been really hard for him to get clear air. Part of it, quite frankly, it wasn't helped by this pre-selection disaster in New South Wales. A lot of that was his own making. And I think if Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells, for example, had not have made the Senate ticket 6 months ago, she still would have unloaded on him and the government. But it would not be such a distraction. And that sort of led to what's happened with Toke And then it's led to this idea that anything against the Prime Minister is fair game. And that's exactly where he doesn't want to be at this stage of the cycle. But in my view, the best way to get clear air is to pull the trigger on the election campaign. And you'd have to think if he pulls it on Sunday, and that's what everyone's talking about on Sunday night, then I think he'll be hoping the blowtorch really goes on Anthony Albanese. And that's going to be key, because the problem for Albanese in this term with COVID is he hasn't had enough airtime. That was their main complaint. Now he's going to be having all the airtime and all the pressure. And really the coalition's key aim and hope is that he crumbles.
In fact, Matilda, maybe more airtime than an opposition leader, or certainly an Anthony Albanese-style opposition leader, actually wants. The thing about campaigns is you can't escape it, though. You have that entourage, you have that media attention bolted onto you for 5 or 6 weeks. It's pretty obvious, isn't it, Matilda, that Scott Morrison is making Anthony Albanese issue number one?
Completely. And like, I mean, from a perspective of, you know, someone who's not 100% always focused on that, you know, covering a broad range of news, it does feel like there has been a significant ramp up of the political spin from Morrison, which potentially, given the Scotty from marketing nickname, isn't an ideal sort of idea. And this kind of constant throwing back to Anthony Albanese, any question you ask, eventually you let him talk long enough, it turns into, well, Labor didn't do this, Anthony Albanese didn't do this. I can't really see how that's a huge benefit to someone who, one of their main objectives should be, you know, needs to be coming off very authentic and, you know, down to earth and all of that sort of stuff.
He might think though, also, Matilda, that worked really well for him with Bill Shorten in a way it did.
I think to a certain degree, Bill Shorten, you know, had a lot more attention on him, and maybe that is part of, I don't know, I guess there could be an argument to be made that Albanese is coming in at least as a slightly more blank slate than Shorten, with a little bit less baggage. But this idea that Morrison keeps putting out, which is that I'm not going to call the election because I want Anthony Albanese to, you know, go through the grilling. I want the Australian public to be able to see him. I don't think holds a huge amount of water with the average viewer. So I think like the drawing everything back to Anthony Albanese, you know, it's an attack dog strategy, but it's whether it's really going to be effective in this circumstance.
All right, well, I'm going to ask Angus in just a moment what he thinks of that, but just to quickly update you on some breaking news, word has reached us from the High Court that it has cleared the way for Scott Morrison to go ahead and call the election. I can't bring to you the precise terms of the decision as it's been handed down, but its net effect, when paraphrased by us here in the media, is that it's no impediment to the calling of an election. So that's the High Court clearing the way in that case over the New South Wales Liberal Party and the federal intervention. So there you go, Angus. That's another impediment removed there, and I guess that puts us back where we started. The weekend comes into play. But on the question of Anthony Albanese, it's very clear that Scott Morrison's dialling it right up there. Blank slate. He has to front. He has to answer. What are the Labor leader's vulnerabilities?
I think it's clear that Albanese has played a small target strategy for a long time, and that's been I think a pretty successful one so far. He's put himself in the polls in a position to win when, as we've seen, mostly through the pandemic, leaders have won elections, they've won re-election. But I think what Morrison is doing is giving himself the best chance to win, because he knows he's a good campaigner. In 2019, everyone wrote him off. And when I was out there on the campaign with him in 2019, you could see how people reacted to Morrison. They were warm. And even when he had an attempted egging back in 2019, you know, he sort of shrugged it off and went through it, whereas Shorten probably was not as warmly received on the campaign trail. So I think Morrison is backing himself to do the same thing he did in 2019, which is essentially win from behind, back his campaigning skills, and see if Albanese can match him as a campaigner. And
Anthony Albanese is a big political character to those who know him. Sure, he's probably straitjacketed himself a little in the name of discipline and leadership authority. But you'd have to think that in those pub environments, shopping mall environments, he has that 26 years of built-up experience to pull those settings off.
You'd think so, and I think what most people probably don't realise about politicians when they see them struggling to answer very difficult questions on TV every day is that they're generally more charismatic than most people realise.
Right.
It's just that if you were put on TV having to answer very difficult questions, you'd probably struggle and look like a bit of a deal as well. So I think he probably can handle those settings pretty well, but I guess the question is he feeling too straitjacketed by the fact that they're about to win, or they think they're about to win?
Yeah, well, that's often an explanation. Greg Brown, I'm imagining that you may well be one of those journalists out there peppering the opposition leader and or the Prime Minister with the difficult questions throughout the campaign. Same question to you that I put to Angus. What do you think, Bill? We've spoken a lot about Scott Morrison. I'm not trying to let him off the hook, but what do you think Anthony Albanese's vulnerabilities, if any, are?
I think his vulnerabilities are that while the public does not like Morrison, they haven't warmed to him either. And while he's personable and charismatic, well, he's charismatic in a personal sense, he's not a charismatic political leader as such. He's not someone that's been able to garner the support of the public, you know, based on his personal appeal. So I think that that's a negative for him, because he's played a very savvy game. He's been around for a long time, and he's done he hasn't fallen into the traps of what the Labor Party's done in the past. He's made sure it's been all about the government all the time. But I think that now that the blowtorch is going to be on him a bit more, people are going to be thinking, wow, is this really the guy that we can make Prime Minister? And I think added to that, the small targets worked very well so far, but I was quite surprised they didn't go with something a bit bolder in the budget reply speech, because I think we're getting to the stage now where the focus should be on Labor as much as it is the government. And I think that if they just keep on going small all the way to the finish line, that can potentially be a negative.
Sure.
People will just be asking, well, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? What are their policies? What are they secretly going to put on us if they win?
Yeah, but if you get too bold, of course, and I think we've already had signs of this coming in the Morrison counter-argument, how are you going to pay for it? I mean, that sort of is the next question that it invites, isn't it? They've already been doing that throughout this week, the coalition.
Yeah, but and that's why I think his strategy has been sound for the most part. But I think, you know, I just question whether it's gone on too long and whether the budget reply speech was the time to bring that out, because, I mean, Bill Shorten gave people years to ask him what the cost was, and he have coalition strategists ready to put a cost on everything. Now, Labor's played it smarter than that this time, but, yeah, so, I mean, if you're announcing big policies sort of 2 months out from the election and people are saying, what's the cost, I don't think it opens as many problems or gives the community as much time to be sceptical about it as, you know, as what they did last time.
Yeah. Matilda Boseley, the pitfalls of campaigning are many, and I think both leaders got some taste of that this week. A heckler for Scott Morrison around Lake Macquarie, and a somewhat more muted intervention by a voter in Western Australia. How do you think both are handling those things? Angus has already spoken about it, of course, but what are your own observations on that?
Yeah, gosh, it's just kind of gold for, you know, shareability. I feel like we're still sharing around the Tony Abbott getting sort of called a name in the hardware stores all these years on. They sort of live forever, don't they? I think, I mean, definitely the Scott Morrison one has attracted more attention. And actually listening back the next day when you heard Morrison explaining, you know, actually it was, you know, a complicated issue. We sat down, we actually figured out, you know, what, as he was saying, like my staffers sort of, you know, actually spoke through and there might be a solution, things like that. That response was great, but it's not what people are going to see. People aren't watching the sort of press conference the next day. What they sort of saw was Scott Morrison looking uncomfortable, almost like trying to look away, being like, no, we've had enough of a chat, like, let's go on. If we're thinking about photo ops, it would have been, you know, Morrison sits down at the table and has a beer with this guy, which, you know, seems like almost kind of to a degree via staffers is what happened. But unfortunately, for Morrison, that's not what people are going to remember out of that. They're going to remember him getting yelled at and him trying to get away, which is at least the visuals that kind of carried across.
Yep, and just to punctuate this point in the discussion, words just reached us that police are investigating an egging attack on United Australia Party leader Craig Kelly during a rally at a park in Melbourne's inner southeast. So that's not unique either. I mean, I think that was occurred last campaign as well. Angus, appointments and advertising, they have certainly filled the void for the last week or between budget and today. Many of these jobs have to be filled. But is there a point at which it looks excessive and indulgent?
I think that when you see so many appointments done in 1 week, the big question, I think a lot of people's minds is, why were they done now? Why did you do it literally at the last minute? You could have done this at any point over the past 6 months, a year, and instead you're just rushing through a bunch in the last week. And you see a lot of Liberal-linked names, all this sort of stuff. So I think it's a bad look, but I don't think any government has particularly covered themselves in glory in that stretch.
No, and for that reason, I think, Angus, the Labor Party, while they criticised some of it, I don't think they went the whole hog because there is a history there.
Yeah, and everyone wants to, I mean, if they win the election, they'd like to be able to make the appointments as they see fit as well, and that will include appointing people that are probably Labor aligned or have worked for them in the past. So I think people see it, they might see it, they might be unhappy with it, but when their team does it, maybe it's not so bad. Yeah,
there's certainly a clearing up and a clearing out of legacy issues, if you like. Greg Brown, the other one that we all discovered today was they look like they've removed now the whole caseload of Medivac refugees and asylum seekers who'd been in onshore, effectively hotel and other forms of detention here on the mainland. Do we draw a connection? Do you draw a connection between that and the electoral cycle?
Oh, possibly, but I remember last time it looked like with some of these actions towards the end, you know, Adani being approved at the last minute and things like that, it looked like the government was preparing for a loss. But of course it campaigned and won convincingly. So I think we can look into all this stuff a bit too much. The jobs for the mates thing was a terrible look, I thought, this week. Does it change a vote? I don't think it really does. We're probably at the stage now where the people who think there's an integrity problem with the government aren't voting for them, and you know, passionately feel that way. That whether that's going to change votes in the middle, I'm not so sure. But they should certainly be held for account for every decision they make, including today's decision.
No, fair enough. Well, look, we could speak for much longer, but each of you have day jobs to do, and there's a fair bit of news still swirling around us. I think we brought 2 breaking news elements in the course of this discussion this afternoon. So what we're going to do is thank you and say farewell, at least for now, Greg Brown, Matilda Boseley from The Guardian and Angus Livinston from the SMH Age. Thanks for joining us on Friday Briefing. All of you, we'll get them back before too long. Why don't we just briefly recap that breaking news, or one of them. The High Court has cleared the way for the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, to call an election, throwing out that application to challenge a federal branch takeover of Liberal Party pre-selections in New South Wales. That decision coming from the High Court here in Canberra only minutes ago. That's it for us this week. Have a great weekend. We'll see you Monday.
Secrets, lies and family ties.
I'm Finn, Dennis's son.
You have no idea what he's capable of.
How do we know that you are what you say you are?
The gripping new season of Smother, tonight on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Sometimes I think